Thank you for listening to Rearview Mirror Chronicles. To send me an email, please use rearviewmirrorchronicles@gmail.com, and to send me a message on WhatsApp, +60 16 425 6301. Hello and welcome to Rearview Mirror Chronicles. My name is Keith Hocton. I'm a public historian, author, and broadcaster. And today we are continuing our series on the East India Company, part 2 if you like. When we last left Sir Robert Clive, he's there in India receiving the Diwani from the Shah Alam, the great Mughal emperor, which gives him the right to govern and collect taxes from the Indian people. So things are looking pretty rosy if you're a shareholder of the East India Company. So Clive has a gift throughout his life of astonishingly good timing. He just does. He's always in the right place at the right time, and he has an amazing ability to outflank his opponents of every sort. Initially, it's the French he comes into contact with, and he defeats Dupleix, who's his great rival and head of the French Duzant Company, the East India Company's most annoying rival in India. Then he outflanks Sirajuddaula, appearing out of the blue and retaking Calcutta with armaments that Sirajuddaula didn't realize that the East India Company actually possessed. And in fact, they normally wouldn't have been so well armed, but they are because of a flotilla that has arrived by chance based on false documentation saying that the French were actually going to invade Bengal. And Clive has developed this way of basically terrifying his opponents. He attacks in a very different way to the way most people in 18th century warfare operate. Warfare in India is often a chess game, a complicated chess game with maneuvers, with both sides trying to bribe each other's side's generals, and lots of money passing backwards and forwards. It's also regarded as a game for gentlemen, and they operate using these unwritten gentlemanly rules of war. Clive has no time for this, and he attacks at night. He attacks from the back in the early morning through fog and during thunderstorms, and he absolutely loves doing these denouement, kind of daring operations that actually, in a sense, preempt the modern-day SAS. He actually comes from behind enemy lines, and he just does things that no ordinary gentleman would do. But, as we'll find out, an ordinary gentleman Clive is not. The one extraordinary moment that comes to mind that I'd like to tell you about is Sirajuddaula has lost Calcutta to Clive, and Siraj's armies are encamped in the surrounding fields just outside, and his army is about 40 times the size of Clive's little force. So what does Clive do? He waits for an early foggy morning, and he gets all his troops into canoes and he rows them up the Hooghly River, and they arrive in the dark at about 4 a.m. at Siraj's camp, when the mist is at its thickest. And with relatively small numbers, literally he had a couple of thousand troops, he walks into the Mughal camp where there are currently 60,000 Mughal troops, and he just starts shooting wildly in all directions. And of course, that scares them completely. They have no idea what's going on, and they very nearly kill Sirajuddaula. In fact, a shot goes through his tent. It's those sort of tactics that he's very good at, but he's also becoming very good at operating like that against his enemies in Britain. And once he actually goes back, and keep in mind, he's always coming back and forth from India. He was there during the Carnatic Wars. He then went home, spent all his money, and has to go back out to India again. Then he magically pulls off Plassey, the Battle of Plassey, and gets paid this huge sum of money from the Jagassets, which he banks, and of course then goes back to Britain. And then finally he comes out again at the end of the Battle of Buxar some 6 years later. By this stage, he is the wealthiest man in Europe. And at that point, he starts using his guerrilla tactics not just against Indian rulers, but against his fellow directors of the East India Company. He builds up his own faction within the company. And he's just very, very lucky. He always wins. He's like this modern-day Lord Voldemort, or something like that. He's this figure who has this extraordinary ability to outflank, terrify, and surprise his rivals. And he does it exceptionally well. I also haven't done justice to the fact that the East India Company, which has so much power, so much wealth, is actually there in that position largely due to Clive at this particular time. Because really, it's a tiny operation. And this is the extraordinary thing, and I think this is the thing that most surprised me when I was researching it. For the first 100 years, there were only 35 employees in head office in London. It's tiny. And in India, at the time of the Battle of Plassey, which is in 1757, when the company is actually seizing the most valuable real estate in the world, there are only 250 white men in India. And of course, they're all civil servants. I mean, there are others who are coming in and out on a military basis. But in terms of administrators, civil servants, form fillers, just 250 young men. That now begs the question, of course, what the hell were the Indians doing? I mean, how is it that just a small number of foreigners can come into a country where they're vastly outnumbered, where there is enormous wealth and means? And, we're not talking about military dullards here either, because the Indians have actually been at war with themselves for hundreds of years. So they're practiced warriors. So why is it so easy for them to come in and take what they take? So that question, I think, is actually pretty easy to answer, oddly enough, because in a sense, the British had already tried their hand in the 1680s and had a feel for the Mughals. There's a character then called Joshua Child who tries knocking the Mughals around at the height of Mughal power. Silly thing to do, during the reign of Aurangzeb. And what happens at this point, before the British have got the military edge, before the military revolution has taken place, when the British are still fighting with, Cromwellian pikes and very, very basic muskets, is that the company is knocked out flat in 30 seconds. The Mughals, who have a standing army of 1 million men, surround Bombay. All the East India Company factors, the white employees effectively, are put in chains. And across the country, East India Company factors are thrown into prison. And they have to beg on bended knee, literally, and promise to behave themselves before Aurangzeb actually lets them out. And that's the difference between the 1680s and the 1750s. It's basically two things. One, the Mughal side of the empire shatters. It splits up into individual towns, almost, or at best, smaller regional entities who are completely uncoordinated. They're not acting under a single high command. And two, a military revolution has taken place in Europe, and there are now modern, new techniques of warfare that the Europeans, both the English and the French, are deploying that the Indians don't yet have knowledge of. And as I said in the last episode, that just the sheer firepower is much better. But also what the Europeans realize is that it's not rocket science. You don't need to be some sort of highly educated boffin from the Enlightenment period to operate a bayonet. And very quickly, they train up the local Indians in European tactics. And they get the best local soldiers in the military marketplace by paying 3 times the amount of what they're paying just down the river. So if you're a sepoy for the company getting paid triple what the Tipu Sultan will pay you for the same job in another rival army just down the peninsula, why would you go? Why would you not stick with this foreign force? So in a time when there is anarchy in the countryside, when the Mughal states have collapsed, when other regional powers are all vying for control, the country is still incredibly rich. It's a time of great prosperity in terms of production of cloth and the raw materials that India is producing. And the amazing weaving industry is still going incredibly strong. But there are all these predatory armies going backwards and forwards and fighting with each other. So it kind of makes sense for the East India Company to raise the army the way they did. And these factions that I talk of, keep in mind that they're actually quite small armies. If truth be told, just having a go at each other, because they're now not under a uniting Mughal leader. Now, the big question is, the important question is, why would the local bankers lend money to foreigners? They have a different religion, they look different, they speak a different language, and they are clearly predatory. Why would you lend the East India Company money? The answer is, I think, very simply, is that the bankers and the company are both city boys, and they both understand interest rates, paying on time, and contracts. And the British and the Indian bankers' appetites are the same. All they want to do is make money, and they both realize that they can do very good business together. So what the company does, and this is the extraordinary trick, is that they borrow money from the Indian bankers at 15 to 20% and buy Indian mercenaries. And the battles that are actually fought are not with white troops versus brown troops. It's two armies of brown troops, one led by a white officer, going against each other. Bollywood and Merchant Ivory depictions of these battles always have the white man versus the brown. And I think that's basically because it's easier for the audience to understand the narrative. What's also interesting is when they're hiring people, so hypothetically, if you're transplanting an army of sepoys to fight the Sikhs, for example, you're immediately creating an enmity between the two parts of the country, the northern Sikhs versus the southern Hindus, brown versus brown. And there's a hatred that develops at that stage that will come into play much later. It's the start of these fissures which can then be exploited by the British East India Company, and I think that's one of the Machiavellian ways of why they do it. That being said, the Marathas, for example, have been raiding Bengal and raping, Bengali women for centuries. And to this day, Bengalis actually still put their children to sleep, warning about what the Bungis will do, what the terrible Maharathas armies can do if they invade and if they catch you. Of course, current-day India has been united now for some 77 years. But even now, there are tensions between the Hindus and the Muslims, where the Hindus are actually saying, as an example, that the Taj Mahal, which is clearly a Mughal building, is built on a Hindu temple site. It's not. That's a complete lie. I've seen the documentation that goes back to who originally owned the land and the Mughals that then bought that land from the original owners. And it was never, ever a Hindu temple site. So I don't know why the current Indian government does this. I don't know why they try and perpetrate these lies, because honestly, folks, it's just not true, and I think they're doing themselves a complete injustice. That being said, throughout Indian history, it has been united culturally in that there is a particularly common kind of Hindu culture which runs across the region. Geographically, by virtue of the shape of the peninsula, which is girded, by the mighty Himalayas. But politically, there's only brief moments, like under the Mauryas of Ashoka in 250 BC, or under the Guptas in the early centuries AD, or again under the Mughals, where India is totally united. But most of their history hasn't actually been like that. As the Mughal Empire collapses, what they are united about as a people in their unhappiness is that they're under the East India Company, because the East India Company, at its height, now starts milking India dry. In a way, the rapacious attitude of the East India Company while it's at its height and the height of its powers is what actually leads to its downfall, ironically. And I'll talk about that. So what you have is a lot of kids coming out from Great Britain. You can't join the East India Company after the age of 16. So these are kind of adolescents who, wouldn't, modern day parts of America, for instance, they wouldn't be allowed to have a drink at a bar. And yet here they're being given entire districts to milk. And a lot of them die. There's a huge death rate for these writers, as they're called, coming out to India. The lowest grade of an East India Company officialdom is called a writer. And these guys are basically ledger scribblers, people who have the ability to not so much organize a state, because they did that very badly, but at least enter things into a ledger. And in Calcutta, there is still a writer's building that you can visit. Quite a beautiful building, actually. So if you visit Calcutta, it is the most incredible city. Make sure you pop down to the writer's building. So writers from the East India Company come out at age 16. Their lifespan is effectively 2 monsoons. That's the average lifespan of a European. But once you've got that sort of immunity against Indian diseases and against the things in the Indian water, if you survive that, if they play their cards right and they bribe the right people and they get into the right positions, they can make a massive fortune by the age of about 30. And they can then go home, they can buy a rotten borough, get into parliament, they can buy a nice big house in the countryside or build a mansion and have the life that they dream of. So these people are very much trying to make a fortune and enough money to buy a country mansion or a political seat and get out of India before they either get killed in warfare or get killed by cholera or dysentery. And a lot of them just don't make it. 3/4 of these 16-year-olds don't come back home. And you've got to put that into perspective. As I said, it's a bit of a lottery, really. And, if you're really lucky, you could be one of the big few winners like Clive, where you make a fortune, you come home and you buy not one, but 10 enormous houses, in the countryside, and more in Ireland, which is exactly what Clive did. But most of them end up in Park Street Cemetery in Calcutta, and their bodies rot like the carcasses of sheep, according to one early sea captain who comes in and sees just the number of new graves in the graveyards of Calcutta. But as I said, for those who stay the course, there is money to be made. At this point, just after the Battle of Plassey and Buxar, this is the time of maximum rapaciousness. Now, this is a wonderful time if you're a 20-year-old out to make your fortune and you're based in Calcutta or Delhi. It's the worst possible time to be a Bengali weaver. At this time, for example, we have all sorts of stories of the Brits corralling weavers into effectively sort of weaving concentration camps without ever being allowed home. And of course, the British forced them to make so much per day, so much per week, so much per month. And of course, this then leads to the story of some of them cutting their thumbs off. And I need to explain this to you because in India, this story has enormous currency. The Indians have this industry. They have the best weavers in the world and they have the finest cloth in the world. And as an act of vengeance, because they're not doing what the British told them they had to do, it was rumored that they chopped off their thumbs, therefore killing an entire industry. But that's a story. But did it really happen? Look, this is one story that's based from not a particularly reliable source because the guy who wrote it was actually an enemy of Clive and he was writing a book to try and bring Clive down. Some of it has elements of truth to it. He says that in some cases, these weavers were so badly oppressed and made to produce huge amounts of cloth that they actually cut their own thumbs off so they couldn't weave and that the company had no option but to release them. Later, because it brings it full circle, in a completely different period of history in the mid-19th century, after the Industrial Revolution, when the entire economy of empires changed, and you would now have centers of industrialized textile production in the north of England trying to export textiles to India. In other words, the reverse of the original trade. And it's at this point that story about the thumbs being cut off gets confused. And the story is that way, that the reason that the Indian textile industry declined was that the wicked British cut their thumbs off so that they could steal their industry. And look, with the amount of research that I've done, I can tell you categorically that that's not true. It's definitely wrong. That some weavers could have cut their own thumbs off, which tells you how bad their lives were at the time, is unequivocally the case. What's also true is that the East India Company moves in after the Battle of Buxar and has the field completely to itself. And it does what a modern asset stripping company or bank would do. It takes over the subject company, it sees the things they want and it keeps, and the stuff that they don't like, they get rid of. The stuff that they do want, they put in a ship and send it back to England. And that's predominantly money. I mean, I've used this analogy before. The East India Company doing this is like Jeff Bezos invading a country in many respects. And in that sense, you have this massive corporation whose drive is to make maximum profits. And really, it has no other purpose apart from doing that. And I have to say, that's actually the refreshing thing about the East India Company, is that you don't get the hypocrisy of the later Raj, which sort of pretends to be there in India to civilize the natives and to build railways and to change their religions and so on. But it's there, of course, because empire enriches the mother country. The company has none of this. The company is clearly there to make money. It doesn't tend to be about anything other than a money-making machine. And so while it's far more rapacious, I think, and far more brutally open about its aspirations to asset strip India, it's very frank about it. And weirdly, it finds collaborators, Indian collaborators. So Calcutta initially becomes a tax-free city, a tax-free zone. So the first people to move in there are the Mawaris, who are there not because they particularly like the company of the British, because I don't think they do, but they're there because they don't have to pay taxes. It also benefits them. And they also know they can make massive amounts of money, enormous sums of money, lending cash to the East India Company at very high interest rates that they know will be repaid. So many great fortunes are made by some bankers. While if you're a Bengali weaver out in the village with your loom, things are actually getting very, very tough. And then, if life wasn't hard enough, you get a slight change in direction from the British in that they want a new crop. And of course, they also realize that the first thing that happens after the Battle of Buxar is that they really no longer need to send money out from England. And this is actually quite important. Since the 1600s, the British have actually been arriving with ships full of gold coins, gold and silver coins. And they used these gold and silver coins to produce and buy products in India. After Buxar, they no longer have to ship a single penny from England because what they do instead is they just tax. They land tax the locals. And so with the profits from the land tax, after they've paid all their costs, they then use that money to now buy cotton and silk and saltpeter and everything else that they need. So effectively, it's free money. They're taking the tax from the Indians themselves and they're using that money to finance their company. It's a win-win situation for the company because it's free. They're not spending any money, they're getting huge amounts of land tax, and they're selling the goods that they've always sold but had to pay for all over the world. Then they have a third brainwave, which, again, as far as the coffers of the company is concerned, is a wonderful thing. It's a great time to be a shareholder. But on the flip side of that coin, as India is concerned, it's awful. They realize that they can grow vast quantities of opium on the more marginal land. You know, the fertile land is used for food crops, but the profits aren't as great as the massive profits they are then starting to generate in Hong Kong and China. And the poppy crops suddenly become their main focus of attraction. And what they then start doing is moving those crops onto the fertile land where the food crops used to grow. Great for profitability, terrible for the Indian people. So as the profits grow on the opium trade, and this kind of begins, I think, probably about the 1770s and reaches a peak in the 1790s, 1800s, more and more land is actually given over to poppy production and less for food. And of course, if you're using land that grows food to now grow opium, what happens to the people who need the food? And of course, these events always happen. It's Murphy's Law with other catastrophic natural events. So the monsoon of 1768, brought only the lightest of rains to northeast India. And then the following summer in 1769, no rain fell at all. And instead, the intense heat continued unabated. The rivers dwindled, the water tanks in the villages dried up, and the fish ponds at the center of every Bengali village turned first to sticky mud and then to dry earth. And of course, what happens when that happens? The price of rice rises steadily week by week until, in this particular instance, it had actually multiplied by 5 times. So by October, as the drought heightens, it then begins to turn to famine. And there's great dearth and scarcity, are actually reported around cities like Murshidabad. And by November, the farmers were said to be totally incapacitated to cultivate the valuable crops of cotton and mulberries. James Grant, who was stationed up country near Rajmahal, reported a growing deprivation in his district. In the country, on the highway and the fields, they're strewn with human bodies, people who have actually starved and died. And we know about this report and what was actually happening in the countryside because the East India Company was so good at keeping records. What happened then was, and this is also in the same report, is that multitudes flocked to Murshidabad, where 7,000 people were daily fed for several months by the local rulers. And the same practice was followed in other places. And just continuing with that report, it was actually impossible to walk the countryside or ride through the countryside without breathing the offensive air, without hearing the frantic cries of the people who were starving and dying. And of course, it affected every man, woman, and child. It wasn't discriminatory towards the sexes, and the suffering and the dearth just continued until a gloomy calm kind of, succeeded after the populations had died off. It's an indication, but only an indication of the human suffering that went on at this time. But it gets much worse after that. A lot of these people that are actually coming from Murshidabad and then when they run out of food there, they're arriving in Calcutta in their starving multitudes. And this is a shocking fact. that in 1771, there's estimated to be between 3 and 5 million deaths in Bengal. 3 to 5 million. And let's just take a short break for a message from our sponsor. Autonomous is your one-stop shop for your Malaysia My Second Home visa. But they are much more than that. When you sign up with Autonomous, you become part of a larger community, a community that cares about you in Malaysia. And that's important when you move to a new home. So for more information, call Autonomous or WhatsApp them on +60 12 493 7270 or visit their website www.penangmyhome.com. And we are back. India's not a stranger to famines. They're not. They've had famines when when monsoons have failed, which also caused catastrophic events, even before the British, have turned up. But there's a difference here because when those famines took place, whoever the local potentate is, they will actually do some kind of famine relief. And as I mentioned, a little bit earlier, that in Murshidabad, you had the local potentate there feeding 7,000 people a day for a number of months until the food eventually runs out. But back in Calcutta, where the company is totally in control, not a single soup kitchen is put up. Not a single loaf of bread is given for free. And the reason that happens is because the company doesn't see itself as being responsible for the peoples of Bengal. They tax them, of course, but they are in India just to make profit. And they're incredibly cold-hearted and clear-headed about this. All they want is their taxes. So the first year, even as these bodies are piling up in the streets and the dogs and the vultures are picking at, kind of human bodies as you walk past, in literally every town in Bengal, even as that's happening, the company's soldiers are being sent out with bayonets into the villages to gather taxes forcibly. Let that sink in. And so they're taking money from starving families as if it were a normal year. Again, this is not what the Indians practice. The Indian potentates would always, if in times of famine, would always waiver taxes because they knew that the people had to use the money to buy food to stay alive. The good news about this is that news of this terrible famine and the way that the British East India Company are acting is getting back to London. And of course, we see records of this in Hansard. It's being recorded in parliamentary debates. And of course, there's also evidence of this from the Brits who are in India trying to justify their behavior. And what they're saying is, yeah, the plains are full of dead people. The streets, are where bodies are piling up. And of course, I'm paraphrasing, the plains are littered with the bleached bones of the Bengali weavers. But it's better that they should suffer than my family should suffer. And this is the attitude that the company men have. I mean, it's really quite brutal on so many different levels. So it's interesting because this is the first time that you really get whistleblowers. Remember that the company controls all access to India from Britain. So there's no sort of Robert Fisk or, Christina Lamb, rocking up on a plane or on a boat, in these days and reporting the horrors. There's no BBC reporting every night telling you about the suffering of the multitudes. But this horror is so terrible, so awful that many whistleblowers anonymously write letters to The Spectator, to Gentleman's magazines or to Blackwood's or, whatever the current magazine is, giving these horrific reports of what's going on. And this is the first time that the British public is aware that the East India Company, rather than just bringing them delicious things, to the ports of London every few months, it's actually a company that's operating in a very terrible way. And there are those who very clearly know what's going on. And of course, that includes the East India Company shareholders. And at the annual general meeting in 1772, they're told that the company, despite the famine, have still managed to gather the full whack of taxation. Isn't that appalling? So the reports may be filtering back, but this doesn't deter the awful behavior because the East India Company is doing exactly what the East India Company does. But what is absolutely mind-blowing is its short-sightedness. I mean, you can waggle your bayonet as much as you like at somebody in the countryside who's starving to death. But if they're starving to death and they die, they're not going to weave for you, are they? you're depleting your own workforce by the very fact of what you're doing. So in 1772, like any company trading today, the East India Company has its annual general meeting, and all the shareholders gather in the hall in London, and they are presented with what they want. They are told that the great news is that despite the famine, the East India Company has got its taxes in full. Now, what that means on the ground is that people are hanging from gibbets. Starving people who refuse to give up their last rupee have either been bayoneted or hung because they're refusing to pay. And this reign of terror has actually allowed the East India Company to gather full taxes in 1772. And in response to this, the shareholders actually agree to an increase of their dividend from 10 to 12.5%. So that's the kind of attitude that the shareholders have. They know what's going on. They know that the famine is in place and continuing. But the news, I think, is presented to them because we can see the records and told to them in such a way that they actually think this is good news and that this can continue. And of course, this is only possible if you actually don't care about the people working for you. So it actually doesn't matter if they die because we matter more. Yes, it's also interesting, how very quickly after this news of the starving multitudes, of mountains of dead bodies and, the vultures picking at them and so on, spreads around the country. It spreads widely, and there is a massive amount of pushback from the British public. And the East India Company gets a reputation at this stage of being this sort of murderous, brutal organization that you really don't want to be a part of. And of course, this has major repercussions, not just in England, but around the world. In London, for example, you get a play put on in the Haymarket where Clive of India is actually satirized as Lord Vulture, and people jeer at him when they see him in the streets. But more importantly for Britain, this news reaches the Americas. And since the passing of the Tea Act, which is one of the government's measures to help relieve the East India Company, of its financial problems following the famine, because, well, I'll tell you about that in a second, but this is actually something that breaks the company, and it's something that starts something. So the Americans actually read all these reports from the Gentleman's magazines and the Spectator and the various other dailies that are coming out. And what they are is terrified that the British East India Company is going to be let loose on them with similar results. So just as tea has arrived, and this is the incredible serendipitous thing that, as we look through history, it's one domino connects to another. Just as tea actually arrives from the British East India Company warehouses to Boston, so the Boston Tea Party takes place. And these ships full of tea are bobbing off the shores of Boston Harbor in the middle of the famine that's taking place in India. And this is where you can connect the dots, because the Bostonians at this stage turn around and say, we actually don't want your tea, and we don't want your type of government in here, so get out. And I think the really intriguing thing about this is that this is a lost bit of history because, American historians are not particularly interested in India. They never have been. But it's only now, after I've spoken to a number of 18th century American historians, that they're finding out about all this stuff and joining up the dots. And the tide in many ways turns against the British when the Bostonians, and so the people of Massachusetts, are reading these horror stories about what's going on in Bengal. So that's really amazing, isn't it? That the Boston Tea Party actually started because of what the British East India Company were doing in India. And there's another amazing link between the East India Company and America. They have very similar flags. And when I saw them together, it just blew my mind. And let me describe the British East India Company flag first. It actually looks exactly like the Stars and Stripes, but without the stars on it. And where the stars are in the American flag, that's actually where there's a Union flag, kind of a Union Jack flag. But apart from that, the two flags are absolutely identical. Effectively, it's the same. The East India Company flag is the same as the Betsy Ross. So, no one has actually proven the link. But anyone looking at the two flags can clearly see that the East India Company flag had an influence. And I suppose if you're a flag designer, there's a limited number of designs available, for your new flag. And I think the Americans just borrow the idea from the British East India Company. And that's the biggest irony, isn't it? The British East India Company are actually what starts the nucleus of the revolution in America. And that's just astounding. But then they adopt the East India Company flag after they've thrown the British out. I absolutely love it. Okay, so back to India now. So the famine has started to change people's attitudes abroad, but it's also started to, hit the balance sheet of the British East India Company and hit it very hard. The first year, enough people have got enough savings that the East India Company can actually, coerce the taxes out by bayonet. They can extract the full taxes, even if it involves hanging hundreds, if not thousands of people. And that's exactly what they did. But by the following year, there's absolutely nothing left. There's no new crops. Everyone's last piggy bank is broken into. And people have actually started selling their children. This is how serious this has become. People start selling their farming implements. And more disturbingly, people start eating each other. There's reports of cannibalism coming from the north of Bengal. And at that point, the East India Company realizes the effects of its actions. Every action has an effective reaction. And what they've done, without them knowing it, is actually starved the goose that laid their golden egg. The goose is now dead. There are now no more weavers to weave for them. So by 1773, there is real anxiety. And letters are actually now coming from Calcutta saying there's no money. We're not going to be able to buy any goods. There's no weavers. You have to bail us out because we're making vast losses. And when these letters start arriving in London, there is the first ever global run on the banks. And the first bank to go down is in Scotland. It's called the Ayr Bank, AYR, as opposed to AIR. And in the next 2 months, 32 individual banks collapse across Europe. It's almost like the financial crisis of 2008, but 10 times worse, much, much worse. And of course, it's not just the Lehman Brothers and the Northern Rocks. It's 32 banks that go down. And I guess from what we know of what happens in the next few years, the East India Company is actually judged to be too big to fail. And it's interesting how it all breaks out. So the company, once you retire in Bengal, you can put a chit in to the headquarters, East India Company headquarters in Calcutta. And of course, the idea is that you don't sail home with, £1 million in a chest, but you can actually withdraw your earnings in London. So in 1772, just as all these letters are arriving saying there's no more money this year, a whole load of Brits who have had enough want to flee Calcutta because it's now a charnel house full of dead and dying people. And an exceptionally large number of British East India Company employees head home in 1773 on the fleet. And of course, they put their demands for £1 million or more each to company headquarters when they arrive. That's how much money these people are making. And one after another, effectively, these IOUs turn up in Leadenhall Street at company headquarters, and there is no money for them. So the first thing the company does is approach the newly established Bank of England. And of course, the Bank of England doesn't have the money either, because we're talking really, really new. I mean, these are contemporaneous events. The Bank of England is really freshly minted, if you forgive the pun, and just doesn't have the reserves. So there's only one thing for them to do, is that they have to go to Parliament. The East India Company goes to Parliament, and what effectively happens, because they're about to go bankrupt, and what effectively happens after lots of back and forth and parliamentary debates and various bills have been proposed and shot down, is that finally in 1773 something called the Regulating Act is agreed and goes out. And that's a bit like the moment that Gordon Brown, 10, 15 years ago, actually took over NatWest, where where the British government actually stepped in and said, we're going to have to bail you out. This is exactly what happens with the British East India Company. And basically you have the state buying a 50% share of the company and giving them not only the funds that they need to survive, but bailing them out of all their debts. And this is actually very important for two reasons. The first one is that this is the first time that the state has actually gained any control over the East India Company whatsoever. But the second point is that it's the first time that you actually have a state becoming involved in British imperialism in India. And up to this point, the only involvement, had literally been in odd national emergencies. When Clive actually, found out about this French fleet and asked for the help of the Navy. This is untrodden ground for the company, and they don't like it. And keep in mind, so effectively from 1600 right through to 1773, 173 years, the company is a self-governing libertarian dream, or a nightmare if you're part of occupied Bengal. And these guys have had the complete run of things, complete anonymity. But in 1773, Parliament says, you know what, enough's enough. This is a shocking way to run anything. You can't have a private company, a bunch of merchants effectively running our greatest colony without any supervision. So a whole lot of new structure is then put in place where Parliament, due to the Regulating Act, effectively sends out a bunch of guys to try and sort out what's going on. And this, in the real sense, is when the state starts to take over. It's actually the seeds of the Raj, if you like. So, it was all perfectly fine to have the company do this or to run India when the revenues are actually coming back into England. It's absolutely great. It's fine. But now they have to step in because that's not happening. So just to contextualize this for you, in 1773, George III is on the throne, and he's kind of in and out of hospital and in and out of sanity, if truth be told. Pitt is prime minister. And Pitt's actually a really interesting character because in Parliament, he's actually saying these things, this terrible East India Company men, they're stripping Bengal. But in actual fact, Pitt's own family fortune has come from his father, who worked in the East India Company in Madras. He actually ran it from Madras. And he had famously purchased and then sold an enormous diamond, and called the Pitt diamond, which was the only source of the family fortune. So both Pitt the Younger and Pitt the Elder, managed to finance, and this is the irony, their entire political career with Indian diamond money. There's such a symmetry to that, isn't there? And it's not a beautiful symmetry either. But I mean, there is a symmetry to it. So we've got Mad King George, we've got Clive on the Downs, and we've got a new name that comes up at this time, which is very, very important to the British East India Company. Someone who I actually have a lot of time for, by the name of Warren Hastings, who does have a really rough ride of it in Britain, by Parliament, and in British public opinion, in my view. And of course, this is not a universal view, but hear me out. So when Parliament actually impeaches Warren Hastings, I think it goes for the wrong guy. The guy they should have impeached is Moderation Clive, who, was a complete rotter. Clive was this ruthless dictator who basically just asset stripped India completely. But who is Warren Hastings and what's he like? So Warren Hastings is a completely different animal to the plump, pompous, kind of militaristic Clive. Clive actually hates India. He's always hated India, and he hates Indians. He always has. And he never says a good word about the place. He's not interested in Indian architecture or culture, and he basically sees India as a very boring kind of money box, just waiting to be prized open. And he's very clear about that in all his correspondence. So you're dealing with a man who has absolutely no visual sense, no sense of culture, no sense of civilization. He really doesn't care. He's a money man and he's a soldier. Warren Hastings, on the other hand, couldn't be more different from that. He's an aesthete, he's a linguist, he's been in India since he was 16. He speaks not only Hindi, but Bengali and Persian perfectly. And he also has a great interest and affinity with Sanskrit, which he actually learns, but he never quite perfects. And he is the man who sponsors the first translation of the Bhagavad Gita into English. That's how much he loves this country. And he writes in his letters that he loves India little more than his own country. That's a massive statement. That said, he's actually working for the most rapacious multinational in the world. And while he reforms it, and while he's also responsible, for example, for building granaries for the first time. So when you go to Patna, for instance, there's this famous Gola, which is one of the great monuments in the city. That's built by Warren Hastings to store grain, to make sure there's not another famine, that they don't see another 5 million deaths. And look, I'm not saying for a minute that he's an angel. He's a man of the 18th century making a fortune in India like everybody else. But compared to Clive, he's an absolute scholar. He's a professor, and personally, he's very aesthetic. So when he's put on trial by Parliament, when he's impeached, the famous impeachment of Warren Hastings, which took place in 1784, which is actually one of the great events of Georgian England, because it's when Gibbons and Sheridan and all these great names of the period actually line up to punish, the head of this now infamous company. What they're expecting is some fat, flamboyant, nouveau riche monster. And instead, the man that turns up at the bar is this thin, aesthetic figure dressed in black with white stockings and grey hair. And he looks more like a Puritan preacher about to give a sermon than the kind of, paunchy plunderer that they've been expecting. But I apologize, I'm leapfrogging. But what I'm trying to do is just let you know that Hastings is a better man than Clive, far better. But at what point do the wheels fall off for Hastings? Why is there an impeachment in the first place? So Hastings is put in charge after the Regulating Act. So he's new. He's new to that job, to actually running the company. And, we've had the famine, and we've had up to 5 million people die. And Hastings, who is an East India Company man, is put in charge as governor of Bengal. And he immediately does all sorts of good things. He builds granaries throughout the state to ensure that there won't be another famine. He sorts out the legal system, which is a complete mess. He does all of these incredible things in a very short time. But then, according to the Regulating Act, the regulators arrive. They're there to make sure that everything that is supposed to be done is being done in the correct fashion. But for Hastings, all things with the regulators go bad from the very start. First of all, he doesn't go down to meet them when they arrive at the port. And that's a big mark against him immediately, because what he's almost saying to them is, you're not that important. Where in actual fact, they were. These guys were now head of an organization that had a 50% stake in the East India Company. Then that very same night, as they all turn up for dinner, he turns up in what they describe as a state of undress. He isn't wearing a wig, and he has his slippers on. And these guys, in a sense, have already made up their minds. And of course, they've arrived with a mindset that has been painted by Clive, effectively that Hastings is the villain. And what Clive's doing is trying to protect his own reputation. But he also says that Hastings is too soft and that he's too pro-Indian. So Philip Francis is one of the regulators, and he is a particularly nasty piece of work. He comes out determined that he's going to basically sack Hastings and then take the job for himself. And he's this ambitious, his letters are all full of malice and slander. And he's also probably the author, and this hasn't been confirmed, but I'll go out and say it because I believe it. He's also probably the author of a very famous set of letters called the Junius Letters, which were, they were doing the rounds at the time, but effectively it's the same as what you would do on Twitter. They're breaking a scandal that should never really have been broken. Parliament becomes aware of it. The British public become aware of it. And I think he's the author of those letters. He's just so full of malice and nastiness and darkness. And what he's trying to do is actually bring down Warren Hastings. And the two of them get locked in political combat. And the deadlocking action, on the ground of the company, even as the company's military enemies like the French Duzat are busily, defeating the company troops, these guys are actually arguing and debating. And the same night that the British actually received their first major defeat at the Battle of Pollilore, in 1784, Warren Hastings and Philip Francis, they actually meet in Calcutta on the morning of that battle to fight a duel. The reason this comes about is that Hastings has actually indicated that Francis was having an affair with Mrs. Catherine Grand. She was one of the great beauties of Bengal, highly kind of sought after at events and balls. And this only came about as a tit for tat because Francis had actually leaked information of financial impropriety on behalf of Hastings, the Junius letters. So he calls Hastings out for a duel. And this is actually one of the great comic moments of Indian history. It's hilarious because both Hastings and Francis are men of the pen. It turns out that neither of them have actually the slightest idea of how to load a pistol. Hastings has in fact fired a pistol once. Once. He'd been involved in the attack on Calcutta under Clive in 1757, but Francis has never picked up a pistol in his life, and he's arrived at the duel without the primer that you need to fire the musket. This is how funny this is. He then has to borrow a primer and a musket ball, because he's forgot those two, from Hastings to shoot Hastings. So first of all, Francis is offered the first shot by gentleman Hastings, and he lines up and aims and pulls the trigger, and the gun doesn't go off. And this happens 3 times. And eventually Hastings actually has to show him how to do it. And of course, he takes the shot and he misses. I mean, he's never fired a gun, so not surprising. And of course, then Hastings actually takes a shot and hits him, but he doesn't kill him. It's not a very serious wound. But of course, honor has been avenged. And what then happens is a very brief reconciliation while Francis recovers in Calcutta, and Hastings and he appear to have kind of buried the hatchet. But it's not true. And Francis recovers, and he then returns to England, where he then stirs up the entire country. He joins Parliament, and he then works on, the other characters within Parliament and within the East India Company, and he tells them that the entire evils of the company are basically because of Warren Hastings. The guy hasn't just joined, but it's the first time that he's been put in control, so you can't blame Hastings for everything that's going wrong. And of course, in the background, Clive is very busily, kind of paying people and stirring them up and telling them and agitating them that effectively, the darkness in this company all comes from Hastings. It's all Hastings' fault. The famine was Hastings' fault. The very fact that Hastings wasn't in charge at this point has nothing to do with, Clive's narrative. But clearly, I think, in my mind, I think they get the wrong man. But what happens next is quite telling. Without a doubt, Clive has definitely set the regulators against Hastings, and they'd gone out to Calcutta with the idea that they were actually going to find a crook. But by the time the regulators arrive, Clive is actually dead. Now, keep in mind, from the first podcast, I told you that Clive did have this dark side to him. He had a very depressive side to him. When he's sent out to India for the first time as a writer, he tries to commit suicide twice, and both times he fails. But here we are, Clive's back in Britain, a very wealthy man, but the press are building reports against him, all because of the horrors of the Bengal famine, and these plays are being put on in the Haymarket, and he becomes very quickly this hated, jeered at figure. And, people boo him and they hiss at him, in the streets of London. They throw rotten fruit at him as his carriage drives by. And eventually he's actually called before Parliament. This is just before the regulators are actually sent out to India. He's an incredibly eloquent man, this ruthless soldier, but he's also this fantastic debater. He can actually defend himself very well. And he gathers the chamber together. And, keep in mind that a quarter of these parliamentarians are actually ex-East India Company men. And he gives them this incredible speech, which ends with, my life or my honor. And he walks out of the chamber with his head held high. And a vote takes place, and he very narrowly gets led off by Parliament. It's a very close vote. But he's a marked man. And rather like, Boris Johnson being booed outside Westminster Cathedral quite recently, Clive gets booed, literally as he steps outside the door of Parliament. And he eventually takes his own life. He actually cuts his wrists, with a paper knife, and he's found in a toilet with blood all over him in a collapsed state on the ground. A very unglamorous way to go out. So in his absence, Hastings becomes the focus of attention. He becomes this hated figure. And of course, everybody expects Hastings to, as I said, be this sort of, mega corrupt symbol of, venality and evil. And he turns up in Parliament and he's none of the above. He still goes through with the whole impeachment process anyway, but what Parliament actually see and why they ultimately let him off, because the trial actually drags on for many years, is that he's an aesthete. He can explain himself. He can explain what's going on in very succinct terms. So look, I don't want to pretend in any sense that Hastings is an angel. He's not. But he's far more civilized and he's far more an Indophile character than any who served under him or any who served after him. And under him, all sorts of great things happen. You get the first translations from Sanskrit. You get William Jones founding the Royal Asiatic Society. And the English, for the first time, really realize that India is an extraordinary civilization, that it's this civilization that should be venerated. And Jones realizes that there is a family of languages which Hindi and Sanskrit are actually a part of, which is the same family as ours, the Indo-European languages. And this is also the first time, due to Hastings, that you get British officials in India commissioning artworks from Indian and Mughal painters. So yes, it's still the same extractive and venal organization as it's always been, but under Hastings, there's at least some element of civilization and learning and scholarship and maybe some accountability. So the East India Company, well, what happens then after the impeachment process? So the company, throughout the deadlock of Warren Hastings and Philip Francis, can almost not defend itself because no laws could be passed, no armies could be moved. And it's only when Hastings actually goes home to defend himself in Parliament that the East India Company can actually get its act together. He's in a position, because he's in London, where he can orchestrate things very quickly. And by this stage, it's got some very, very serious new enemies. It's got Tipu Sultan in the south, and it's got the Marathas, who started in the Deccan, if you remember, in the middle of India, but have now filtered all over. And they're an extremely powerful force. And there's extremely serious rival warlords like Sinda and Holkar who are running it, who are running these armies at this particular period. And so what you have now is, between the departure of Hastings in the 1780s and the peak of company influence in about 1800, a series of serious military campaigns. And the company wins them not anymore because it has this military edge, because the Tipu and the Marathas actually have both learned their lessons. And they've employed Frenchmen to teach them. They've got new cannons. They've got up-to-date ballistics. They've got new muskets. In fact, they've got all the same armaments as the East India Company. And they're fighting in the same formation in the same way, basically because they've got lots of French and various other Europeans to teach them, these new modes of European warfare. So the company's lost that edge. And the reason they ultimately prevail is twofold. First of all, it's got Bengal, which is the richest province in the country, and it can generate more revenue and generate more soldiers with that revenue than anyone else. So ultimately, you get bigger armies than the others. And secondly, they're always being supported by the bankers, because the bankers know that they can get their money back without any whim whatsoever from the British East India Company. And that's not the case when they're lending money to their fellow compatriots. So the East India Company have a constant line of credit. And when emergencies arise, like these wars, they go to the banks and they can immediately borrow £1 million, and they can instantly transfer that into muskets, bayonets, and cannon and soldiers. And the battle between these two enemies, the Tipu Sultan of Mysore and the various Maratha, kind of forces, they're very, very close. And if India, and this is the irony, if India had managed, even at that stage, in the 1780s, at the time of Warren Hastings, if the Marathas and the Tipu Sultan had managed to stand together, there's a moment, there's a moment when a brilliant Maratha statesman called Nana Fadnavis, he nearly pulls this off. And he realizes that even at this point, if they stand together as three forces, the Tipu Sultan, the two Maratha leaders, if they just stood together, they can defeat the company. But instead, the companies are able to first take out Tipu Sultan with Maratha help, and then the company is actually able to divide the two Maratha leaders, Scindia and Holkar, and they fight them separately. They never unite and they never fight together. And had they done so, the East India Company would have been defeated and history would have changed completely. And so one by one, the enemies of the company go down. And that leaves us in 1799 at this particular moment when suddenly the East India Company's armies have actually grown to 200,000 troops, just at a point when the British Army is only at 100,000 troops. And this, I think, is in a sense the climax of company rule. It now has this vast army. It's conquered or is taken control by proxy of every court in India, south of the Himalayas. And it's only Rajat Singh and the Punjabis who are holding out. Well, I think we'll leave it there and we'll pick this up next time on the bumpy fate of the British East India Company. From here on in, it actually looks very rosy, but it doesn't remain so. And the next volume, the final volume that I'll tell you about, is quite shocking. So please join me for this continuing chapter of the British East India Company. Bye for now.